I am going to go ahead and share my screen, and I want to remind you about a few things. Let me get into the right course. Okay, this is Elementary Statistics 2, Stat 2401. And let me remind you that I need you to complete the orientation quiz by Sunday at 11:30 p.m. And there are several ways to access it. Remember, you can either use the link that is provided in the welcome announcement, which will take you directly to the quiz. You can navigate to it under the Start Here folder, under the Welcome page. Again, it is linked at the bottom of that page. In case you were not here on Tuesday for the introduction, under the Start page here in D2L, you'll find the course syllabus. You'll need to read that in its entirety before you take that orientation quiz. And then, of course, the course outline, which kind of lays out for you what topics we're going to be covering on a particular day. Has anyone had any issues with the navigation of the course? Is there any way that I can answer questions or help you with that before we continue?
I just have one question. You said that when we get our mini tab, what was the day that it was going to open up again, or that we'll have access to that?
The day that you'll have access to Minitab will be next Wednesday, which is August the 24th. And once you have it, I'll try to remember to walk through it maybe next Tuesday at the end of class, so you'll be prepared to download it. But there are instructions under the Start Here folder. There's one labeled Minitab Online, and it gives you step-by-step instructions with screenshots on how to download Minitab to your personal computer.
Okay, thank you.
One of the challenges you may have is that if you don't have access to Minitab yet and you're trying to work ahead, it's really difficult because really starting with lesson 2 on descriptive statistics, you really need Minitab from that point forward. I do apologize for that, but again, it's just we have to verify that you're going to be enrolled in the class before we grant you free access. If you had Stat 1401 in a recent semester, you may still have access, but that's doubtful because they usually clear it at the beginning of each semester. So just hang in there. We'll get there. But the instructions are there, and I'll try to walk us through it next Tuesday in class. Other questions? All right, then I want to go ahead and look at, and I'll show you where it is in case you want to access it later. We are in Stat 2401 Module 1. We've looked at the introduction, and then I kind of supplemented that a little bit with some review of the statistics vocabulary that you needed to be familiar with. And today we're going to focus on data and visualization. Again, hopefully you have the PowerPoint for data and its visualization, and then there's also one for types of data visualization, which we'll hopefully get to as well. But a lot of this, hopefully, again, will sound familiar to you. It's something that was taught in Stat 1401. So if you had it recently, hopefully it's a review. If it's been a while, hopefully it'll jog your memory. So we're going to get into data and its visualization. So data, we did talk about on Tuesday, is the actual responses or the values you get when asking a particular variable. So for example, if I were to ask you all, what is your eye color? The response that you give me, kind of the answer, if you will, to that question would be my data. Okay, so examples again with eye color: blue, green, hazel, brown. I could ask you for your height. I could ask you your age. I could ask you your salary, although that's typically not appropriate to ask someone that. I could ask you your political affiliation, which your responses would be Republican, Democrat, or Independent, most likely. But again, the data that we collect is the actual responses. And it's important whenever you're doing research that you know from the beginning what type of data you have. Data is classified by its characteristics, and it's important to know what type of data you have from the beginning, because that kind of determines or drives what statistical analyses you can and cannot do, what graphs or data visualizations you can or cannot do. And so it's important to know from the beginning whether or not or what type of data you have. And so data can be classified by type, but also by level of measurement. And I have two graphics on the next slide, but I think it might be easier kind of if I draw it as we go so that you can see kind of what I'm talking about. So we're going to walk through on paper the types of data, okay, so that you can hopefully get a sense of it. So data, let me get my pen to work. Data is kind of the information that we collect, whether that's on eye color, height, weight, you know, that's the what. Data is the what. What do we want to know about? And in terms of type, there are two types of data. The first type of data is qualitative. Okay, that's an adjective. And if you think about it, it is the adjective form of the word quality. So qualitative data tends to identify or be some kind of quality of the data. We also sometimes can refer to, you'll see qualitative data referred to as categorical, because it is typically categories. It's going to be words or phrases. So again, that's going to be things like eye color, political affiliation, gender, religious affiliation, ethnicity. It's going to typically be words or phrases. What's challenging to students is that it might or could be a number, but it's a number with which we would do no calculations. An example might be your Social Security number, your Georgia Highlands ID number, your bank PIN number, the number of the jersey if you played, say, football, basketball, baseball, or some kind of sport, soccer. It's a number that we would not typically calculate with, but like your Social Security number is used by the government to track you. It's the way they identify you. It's more of an identifying number more so than one that we would calculate with. So you have qualitative data. On the other hand, you have quantitative data. Quantitative is again an adjective, and that is the adjective form of the word quantity, which I hope makes you think of a number, because quantitative data will always and forever be a number, and it's a number that we can calculate with. So we're looking at things like age, height, weight, blood pressure. Okay, so it's going to be a number. It's typically associated either with some sort of count or with some sort of measurement. Quantitative data, if we're dealing with numbers, those numbers can be broken down into two additional categories. I'm going to have to scroll down. Okay, can be broken down into two additional categories. One of those categories is called discrete, and the other is continuous. Discrete is typically going to be, it's quantitative, so it's going to be a number, but it's a number that's associated typically with counting, and it's going to be in whole units. With discrete data, we have no fractions, no decimals. Okay, so think about like counting the number of eggs that a hen lays, counting the number of books on a shelf, counting the number of students in a classroom. Okay, you're counting the number of phone calls you get in a day. It's kind of one of those deals, you either get a phone call or you don't get a phone call. There's not a halfway. So discrete is going to be a number because it's quantitative, so it's called quantitative discrete. It's a number, and it's typically associated with counting, and it's going to be whole units. Quantitative continuous. Continuous is usually associated with a measurement or with measuring because we use some sort of tool, and we could have decimals or fractions. I always think about it sort of like if I got a measuring stick that goes from 0 to 1, I could break it down into half units or quarters or eighths or 16. We could keep breaking it down into smaller and smaller and smaller units. Think about time. Time, we can talk about it in terms of days, hours, minutes, seconds, microseconds, milliseconds. I mean, we can break it down as far as we want. So continuous, again, is typically associated with measuring, even using measuring blood pressures or temperatures. Again, you can have those decimals or fractions because you could have part of a whole. So in terms of the type of data, there are three possibilities. So let me see if I can get this all three on the screen for you here. Okay, so you have basically three possibilities. In terms of type, your data is either going to be qualitative, quantitative discrete, or quantitative continuous. Now again, I have kind of that same picture on the screen or on the PowerPoint with notes on it, but I thought it might be easier for you to kind of see what was going on if I drew it for you by hand. Questions on qualitative or quantitative?
So qualitative will never stand by itself. Like it'll either be discrete or continuous. It'll never just be qualitative.
Um, if it's discrete or continuous, it has to be quantitative. It would be a number.
Okay, thank you.
See, let me go back over to my picture. See, qualitative is kind of more the standalone. It's going to be just qualitative. But if it's quantitative, you have to go that step further and say, okay, it's either discrete or it's continuous. So if it's a number, you got to think about the context in which it's being used.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Other questions? Okay, another way that we measure data or classify data is by what we call the level of measurement. Okay, it's called the level of measurement. And there are 4 levels, and I usually picture these as a staircase, because as you move up the staircase, you don't lose the characteristics from the step before, but it also, as you move up the staircase, there's more you can do with the data. The further you are, the further you can go up the ladder, the higher the level of the measurement, the more you can do. So in a sense, there's very little analysis you can do if you're on the first step, but if you're on the top step, there's lots. Okay, so you like to kind of be as high up on the staircase as possible, and sometimes you can and sometimes you can't do that. So let's talk a minute about what those 4 levels are. And again, I do have them on the PowerPoint, but again, I think this might be a little bit easier for you to see. Okay, the first level is called nominal. Nominal is actually the adjective form of the word name. So the nominal level is just categories. There's no sense of order to them, no sense of ranking. It's just categories. And because it is qualitative data, we are not able to do any kind of calculations with them. So nominal would be things like eye color, gender, trying to think of some others. I know there's plenty more. Your particular field of study, your pathway, the types of movies, like the categories, drama, comedy, horror, sci-fi. Again, those are just categories. So that's nominal. As we move up the ladder, or up the steps to the second step is ordinal. Okay, ordinal is the adjective form of the word order. The ordinal level is categories with a sense of order. There's some sort of ranking. But those rankings are subjective, meaning they're open to the interpretation of the researcher or to the reader. An example of ordinal would be like movie ratings. We have G, PG-13, PG, R, and then you can go up from there. So there is a sense of order there. Think about high school, or even college, we talk about freshman, sophomore, junior, senior. Again, those are categories, but there's a sense of order. We know that freshman would be first year, sophomore is second year, and so forth. So you have that sense of order. Even in, like, say, cooking contest, or like a chili cook-off or a bake cook-off, where you have that sense of judging. You know, you may be first, second, or third, but again, that was open to the interpretation of the judges. For example, my brother-in-law does competition barbecue, and one week he may win first place, but then the next week he goes to a different competition with different judges, and maybe he only places third. So again, it's very subjective and open to the interpretation of the judge or the researcher or the person of interest. Now, one thing I want to point out is that these first two levels, I'm going to draw a big line right here in the center, maybe. Okay, those two levels apply only to qualitative data. So the two types, the type of data, whether it's qualitative, quantitative discrete, or quantitative continuous, okay, is connected to the level of measurement. And if it is qualitative, then it is either going to be nominal or ordinal. Those are your only two choices. As you move to the third and even the fourth step, those two apply only to quantitative data, and it applies whether it's discrete or continuous. Okay, so if you know that you have qualitative data, then in terms of the level of measurement, it's either going to be nominal or ordinal. And it comes down to, do you have a sense of order or not? Then when you get to quantitative, if you know you have quantitative, you have the other two categories. The third step, so your first option for quantitative is interval. Okay, so interval, I don't really have a fancy word to connect to interval, but it is going to be numbers. Okay, they are numbers, so they are ordered. At the interval level, we can begin to do some calculations such as addition and subtraction. We can talk about how that one person is shorter than another, or one is older than another. You can begin to make comparisons by addition and subtraction. One of the primary characteristics of the interval level, and it's one that sometimes gives students fits, is that at the interval level, we do not have a true zero. And I'll explain what that means, but that's important. Okay, I'm going to scroll down for just a minute so I can explain true zero and not mess up our little table here. Okay, typically when we hear the word zero, or at least when I hear the word zero, I think I have none or nothing. Okay, and that's true. That is what we mean by a true zero, is that a true zero implies that we have none or nothing. Well, at the interval level, we're saying there's not one. That zero at the interval level does not imply none or nothing. At the interval level, that zero is simply a placeholder. It kind of tells us where we're going to begin counting. And I'm actually going to write the examples down here because, again, this is one where students kind of struggle. So examples of interval are things like years, which is sort of like time. You know, I can tell you that this year is 2022. My daughter was born in 2007. I was born in 1968. But then if you really think about it, guys, how in the world do we know that it's 2022 or that it was 2007 or whatever? We know that because at some point humanity began marking off the years. So at some point we had a year 0 where we started marking off the time. But to say that there was a year 0 does not in any way imply there was no year. It is simply the point or the place where we began counting or marking off the measurements. Another example is IQ scores. Okay, if I say that you scored 0 or that I scored 0 on the IQ test, that does not mean that I have no brain. That's crazy to say that I have no brain because I scored 0. It either means that I'm not very smart, or I haven't taken the test yet, or I just didn't do well. Okay, it doesn't mean that I have no brain. That 0, again, is where we simply start the measurement scale. The other one that's a good example is temperature. Okay, if I tell you that it's 0 degrees Fahrenheit outside, that does not mean there's no heat or no temperature. It means it's cold. Okay, so that's the one that really, that concept of no true 0 is an area where students tend to struggle. But I'll try to help you figuring that out here in just a minute. The last level of measurement is ratio. Okay, ratio, again, are going to be numbers. They can be ordered or ranked. At the ratio level, we can actually perform all 4 basic mathematical operations. So we can add, subtract, multiply, and divide at this level. So I can talk about something being twice as fast or twice as slow. At the ratio level, we do have that true 0. So at the ratio level, 0 does imply none. So think about like the number of eggs a hen lays. It could be 0. The number of phone calls you get in a day, you could get 0. Okay, so at the ratio level, you have a true 0. And in my mind, it's easier to think about it from that respect. When I'm trying to decide between interval and ratio, I stop and ask myself, what would it mean if I had 0? You know, what would it mean if I said the temperature is 0 degrees Celsius? Does that mean none, or is it simply a placeholder? So I kind of work, in a sense, I work backwards because I start out asking myself about what could that 0 mean. So those are your 4 levels of measurement: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. Remember that nominal and ordinal only apply to qualitative, and interval and ratio only apply to quantitative, whether it's discrete or continuous. And again, I have that nice staircase on the PowerPoint. So do you have questions? I know that one of the things you're asked to do on the first quiz is to classify what type of data you have to determine whether you have qualitative, quantitative discrete, quantitative continuous, whether you have a nominal, ordinal, integral, or ratio. And again, hopefully that sounds familiar to you, and it'll be a review from the topics that we talked about, or that you talked about in Stat 1401. So it's important from the beginning to know what type of data you have. So you have to know how to classify that data, because then we have to be able to use that data. Data in today's world, guys, all types of companies, regardless of what type of industry or what size they are inundated with data on a daily basis. And quite honestly, so are you. We talked about that last time, that you can't hardly turn on a news report, read a newspaper, even look at your social media without being kind of in your face with at least one statistic. Today, lots of companies, organizations deal with what are called big data. We call it big data. And big data is really just large, diverse sets of information from lots of different sources. You know, especially over the last 2 years, they've been tracking the COVID-19. And guys, they don't take that information from just one place. They try to get information from lots of different places, and they have tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of pieces of data. That's what we call big data. And that can be kind of daunting or scary, because you have so much when you look at that huge of a data set. But the more information you have, the better your results, your conclusions are going to be. We analyze that big data to kind of look for patterns, trends, and associations. But using that big data doesn't necessarily revolve around how much you have, but what you do with it. That's what I'm talking about. The more you have, the better your conclusion, the better your results are going to be. But it's important that you analyze it properly. It's just, you have more. You can take data from any source and analyze it to find answers. But the more data you have, the better your results are going to be. So we deal with, really, data scientists today deal with big data. And one of the first things you have to do with your data is sometimes you have to do what they call clean it. Okay, if maybe there's some information that you don't really need, or you're missing a lot of information, you may want to try to get rid of that particular variable or that piece of information. But guys, data scientists who spend time, that's their job, is analyzing data, spend 50 to 80% of their time organizing and preparing the data before it can actually be used. Some companies have people who literally sit all day and kind of organize and clean up the data so that someone else can begin to make sense of it. But one of the key tools, one of the main tools that are used in organizing data is to create pictorial or graphical presentations of the data. And that's called data visualization. Data visualization, using graphs or pictures to communicate the information, is very helpful. And so it's one of the main tools that you need to be familiar with from the statistics world. So what is data visualization? It's basically a pictorial, meaning it's a picture, or graphical representation of the information and the data. It's used a lot because, especially on television, even on the internet, that kind of thing, it gives a quick and easy way to see trends, outliers, and patterns within the data without someone having to sit there and stare at it for hours. Universally, it is used in all industries in all countries. And they're pretty much standard. I mean, sometimes there's some fancy dancy nuances to different kinds of graphs, but for the most part, you can stick with basic graphs that you're probably already familiar with, like bar graphs, circle graphs, sometimes pictorial graphs where they use pictures rather than bars, but they're used universally across the world and in all companies. Again, another benefit of using pictures is that a person's eye can be drawn to colors and patterns. And so you have that eye-catching picture that flashes up on the screen, or if you're flipping through a magazine or a newspaper, it might, catch your attention and you would stop and read that information. All right, looks like it's hung up on me again, guys. So let me stop the share and I'll go out and fix it. But while I'm doing that, do you have questions? Okay, let me go back to the share now. I don't know, it gets hung up every now and then. All right, so data visualization also helps us kind of tell our story with a purpose. You want to make sure that someone can really look at your graph if they know nothing else and know what you're trying to say, or at least what information you're talking about. It's so important when you create graphs and tables and pictures that you give it a title. If you need to, you have to indicate what each color represents, that kind of thing. But and you can decide which way to present it. Should you use a bar graph? Should you use a line graph? Would it be better to use, say, some sort of map or some sort of picture? It becomes a very delicate balancing act between form and function. Yes, you want it to be eye-catching, but you also want it to be communicative. Whoo, what a word. You also want to be able to communicate your information in a very simple way, and really, quite honestly, in a very concise and quick way. Some consider data visualization another form of visual art because it's going to grabs your interest and keeps your eyes on the message that you're trying to communicate to your employer, to your stockholders, to people in general. Again, I've mentioned it several times that data visualization helps us to understand lots of information and data very quickly. You may not realize that humans can process visual images 60,000 times faster than text. So I'm not doing a very good job today because I have mostly text, but humans can process visual images 60,000 times faster than text. Again, because you can use those tables and graphs and pictures to communicate lots of information and data quickly, it enhances the communication between you and your stakeholders, whether that's just your boss, whether it's your board of executives or whatever. And so because you can communicate that information so readily and so easily, hopefully that leads to faster decision making so that you can move forward and continue to help your company profit. The data visualization also helps us to begin to look for relationships and patterns, more so than just looking at a bunch of numbers. We can begin to see emerging trends from within the data. Again, it communicates your story or the message to others in a very quick and concise way. Images speak louder than words. Remember the old saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words. So again, the visual aid, okay, is going to be speak louder than just a bunch of words. It may also help you to identify areas that need attention or possibly areas that need improvement. Okay, questions. One of the things that you're going to be asked to do on the first mini project, you're actually going to be asked to create a graph using Minitab, and I'll show you how to do that probably next class. But beyond creating that one, you need to be able to interpret it as if you were writing a report to your employer, to your board of executives, or even if you're going to write a research article to be published in a journal or magazine or the newspaper. So I pulled a couple of graphs this morning. That's what I was doing right before class for us to kind of take a look at and hopefully get you to interact and kind of give me an idea of what you see. Guys, there are all different types of graphs. In fact, if we go out and I just type in graphs in the news, okay, and I can do today or 2022, I get all sorts. I mean, if I click over here to images, I mean, you can just see there, that one's kind of a line graph. We got some bar graphs. This one's interesting because, let me see if I can get it to pull up. It uses circles and the sizes of circles to indicate the different income groups. And then it has different colors for different things. So it's a different kind of graph, but it's still a graph. And you have to be able to kind of know how to read those graphs and interpret them when they're presented. So that's one of the skills that I want you to be able to kind of do, and you're asked to do that on mini project 1. And so I want us to take a look at, I pulled this graph from CNBC, and one of the first things you want to do whenever you look at a graph is hopefully it has a title. Every graph should have a title with lots of detail because that gives you the context for what you're looking at. So this particular graph is seasonally adjusted unemployment rates for Black, Latino, and white. And notice the Black, Latino, and white are in color. And so graphically, the Black are represented by the gold color. Latino is blue, and white is kind of the turquoise. So they kind of give you that. They also indicate right below the title that a solid line is men and a dotted line is women. And you need to notice all these things. You need to notice what the scale is. This one looks like you have dates on the horizontal beginning in January of 2021 and running through at least April of 2022. And then it doesn't indicate so, but it looks like maybe the vertical scale is percentages. And I can recognize that because of the percent symbol. There's also some footnotes. It tells me that this graph includes workers 20 years, I got the yawns this morning, 20 years and older as of June 2022. So this would not include like your teenagers who are employed perhaps. And it gives you the source of who created it and also the source of where the information came from. So guys, you got to pay attention to all that kind of stuff when you're looking at a graph. But if you're creating one, you also have to recognize that you need to put that information on there. So take a minute and look at this graph and then maybe give me one thought of what you see. What is a trend you see? What is something unusual that you see maybe within this particular graph and this particular data? Again, this is something you're going to be asked to do on mini project 1, so I wanted us to kind of practice it a little bit this morning. So take a minute, look at it, and then I'll ask you to maybe respond. Abigail, would you mind unmuting and maybe give us one of the observations that you've made?
So you can see from January to April, there's a decline across all races that they're tracking unemployment rates for.
Very good. Very good. That's a good observation. Thank you, ma'am. Catrice, what about you?
I see from October to January for Black women, there is a big kind of decrease in that area. And then it goes up, but then it still kind of trickles down from
It
there.
seems to be lagging. You're right. Do you have a thought about why that? You got to figure that low point is roughly around November, December of 2021. You have a thought about why that might be?
I could be wrong, but I know that probably COVID in that area, maybe the start of it.
That would be my gut instinct. And we don't know that, but that would kind of be my gut instinct that that's related to the COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Naomi? Naomi?
I was gonna say they're all declining.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes, we can say that they all declined. One of, you can kind of notice that it's almost unusual, but it seems to, one of the things that kind of jumped out at me is that how that Latino women, I mean, yes, it goes up and down, but they tend to be unemployed more so than Latino men. Notice how that blue dotted line is pretty much above the solid one. So Latino women are typically unemployed at a higher rate than Latino men. Okay, very good. Again, you're just looking at what the information that's there. Let me scroll down. I've got another one. That one, by the way, I mean, I assume you recognize that as a line graph, by the way, guys. Here's one that's a bar graph. It's also from CNBC. Again, if we look at the title, this is May, and I believe this is May of 2022. Jobs, 1 month net change, how the job market changed in these various areas. This is by the same author, and again, it gives us the source of the information. Okay, so take a minute. Catrice, I'm going to start with you this time. What do you observe?
I think just right off the bat, noticing that retail trade is in the negatives, 60.7K. That's weird. And I guess, I don't know, it's almost uncomforting to see that they're in the negatives that far.
Mm-hmm. That's basically saying that there was a loss of about 61,000 jobs in retail trade.
Mm-hmm.
I would wonder if that's being again affected somewhat by the COVID, because since COVID hit, a lot of people have begun to use online
shopping. Yes, ma'am.
Shopping, yes, as opposed to retail. But also, even in the area that I live in, you can't hardly go by a store without seeing a help wanted sign.
Right.
Where I live in Gordon County, we have an outlet mall. And I know every one of those stores practically have a sign on the door or in the window. So yeah. I don't know. We seem to be losing that job market for some reason. Naomi, what jumps out at you?
I don't understand it.
Okay. I'm having trouble hearing you just a little bit. Yours is a little jumbled up, Naomi, which is okay. It's probably just a slow internet. That's fine. Abigail, what do you think?
If you kind of look where it's like separated almost between that manufacturing and construction, like everything above construction is kind of like involving people, and below kind of more like back end stuff. And those are the lowest, which probably is contributing to why the retail is so low.
Very interesting. Very interesting. One of the things that I guess in some ways could also be comforting is that the leisure and hospitality net change for the month of May was 84,000, which means people are beginning to kind of maybe go out and about again, because leisure and hospitality, you're probably looking at hotels, resorts, those kind of things that maybe were shut down. So that could be, the fact that that's up could be a positive thing. Okay, I want to show you one more. Again, this is a bar graph. And this one I'm just going to, I linked to show you what they do sometimes, especially in news reports and things. This one uses a map, and it is actually tracking hospital stress levels in the various states. Okay, so they have different colors. It indicates that green is low, yellow is moderate, orange would be high, but apparently there's no high, and then red would be extreme. So this looks like, it shows the stress on hospitals in the various states. And at this particular point, when this map was created, pretty much all of the states were either low or moderate. They also provide below here, it gives you a comparison map to 2 weeks prior and 4 weeks prior, so you can look at how perhaps things have changed. If you notice, Alaska, for example, 4 weeks ago was in the moderate, was low, and then it's gone up to moderate, which unfortunately might mean there's been an uptick in COVID cases in that region. Notice that Georgia in all 3 cases has been low. So you can kind of begin to look at and even make comparisons there to see how things change and what that might imply. They also put this information in a table form and give you percentages so that you can look at it in that respect too. So there's lots of different graphs that can be created, but they don't have to be fancy. The one that you're going to be asked to do on mini project 1, when we get there, is you're asked to do a bar graph, and you're also asked to do one for what's called a histogram. So I want to mention to you, because I don't think it's on this PowerPoint. It might be on the next one, but I don't remember, so I want to mention it. When we think about the different types of graphs, and again, we're not going to look at an extensive list, there are certain types of graphs that you can create for qualitative data, and there are certain types of graphs that you can create for quantitative data. So I want to kind of give you a list. And again, I'm not sure if this is on any of the PowerPoints in the course at this particular point, so you may want to make note of it. Okay, so if we're talking about graphs, which is our tool that we use for data visualization. Okay, there's one set that we use, or there's certain graphs that we use for qualitative, and there's going to be some that we use for quantitative. So I want to talk about qualitative first. The 2 primary graphs that we talk about in Stat 1401, and really in this course that we use for qualitative data, are a bar graph and a pie chart. Now, I've shown you a bar graph, but a bar graph, typically you're going to have a vertical scale and a horizontal scale, and typically your categories will be on the horizontal. They could be on the vertical, but typically you're going to have your categories on the horizontal, and sometimes you have the frequency or it could be a percentage. You have to pay attention to how it's labeled on the vertical. And then you have the bars for each category. One of the things that I want to point out on this bar graph that I've sketched here, and I could go back to the one that we looked at just a minute ago, but one of the things about a bar graph is notice that there are gaps between the bars. Okay. And the gaps are there because those categories, you know, leisure and hospitality is a category unto itself. Manufacturing was a category unto itself. Retail trade was a category unto itself. Your categories are what we would consider standalone. So there's not that connectivity. And so we represent that visually on the bar graph by leaving gaps between the bars. Now, as I've mentioned several times, anytime you create a bar graph, you want to make sure you give it a title, and you want that title to have details so that someone can come along and look at your graph and know exactly what you're talking about. And again, an example, I'll just scroll back up, an example of a bar graph that we looked at today is this one about the May jobs. It's actually a horizontal bar graph because the bars are running horizontally, but you can have one that where the bars run vertically. It's okay. The other type graph that we talk about more so in this course with qualitative data is a pie chart. And with a pie chart, kind of think about it like a pie, a big circle, and then you have it divided into categories, okay, based on the percentages. Typically, the pie chart lets you see how a category relates to the whole. It lets you see how one category relates to the whole. Is it a small piece? Is it a big piece? Is it a huge piece? So it lets you, and typically it involves percentages more so than a bar graph. And I'll see if I can find us an example in just a minute. But even with a bar graph, excuse me, with a pie chart, again, you still want to have a title with the details. You also may need some sort of key or legend to indicate what each color represents if you don't put the labels on there. So let me see if I can Google real quick and find us a circle graph, okay? It's also called a circle graph. I called it a pie chart. Okay, so here's a pie chart. This one says, how much water do we use? And you can see that, you know, toilet is 26.7, clothes washers 21.7%. So again, it's a very colorful way, but we can see how all the different categories that we might have where we use water, okay, are there. Again, notice it does give us the source of the information. We get a title, and the labels are put into each slice along with the percentage. Okay. Again, I kind of assume you know what a pie graph looks like, but just to be safe, there you go. Okay, so those are the two that we primarily deal with qualitative data. Now, those are not the only two types of graphs that we can use with qualitative data, but that's our focus. You'll sometimes see bar graphs where they have maybe more than one bar, where you have multiple bars. if you want to compare different groups, sort of like we were comparing those different ethnicities. This one, for example, this one is a bar graph. It's a little bit fancier, but it shows the different media used by people who supported Clinton, Bernie Sanders, Ted Cruz, and Donald Trump. And so you have each color represents a different presidential candidate, and then it gives you the different types of media. So you can have bar graphs where you have maybe multiple bars, and again, you can compare, for national, it looks like, I can compare the fact that Clinton supporters used national media more so than any of the others, that Cruz supporters were less likely to use national than the others. We can talk about how that across the board, it seems like comedy late night was not a use of media that was used a lot, especially by Cruz and Trump supporters. So again, you can have multiple bars. Okay, that's still considered a bar graph, especially if you have that type of information. Okay, let's talk for a minute about quantitative. We've got about 13 minutes left by my clock. Now, again, because quantitative data is numbers, we really can do a whole lot more with it, and there are a lot more graphs that we could create. Again, we kind of limit ourselves in what we're able to talk about in this course. Okay, but for quantitative, we focus on a histogram, and I believe the other one I asked you to do is a box plot. And I may be getting ahead of myself just a little bit, but that's okay. The histogram is similar to a bar graph, with one big exception. For a histogram, you're still going to have the vertical scale and the horizontal scale. You would have your groups, however you decided to group your numbers, along the horizontal scale. Typically on that horizontal scale, depending upon the software, they're going to either use what are called the midpoints, and we'll talk about which one Minitab does when we look at it. The horizontal axis is either going to be the midpoints of each group. So like if I had a group that went from say 10 to 15, my midpoint would be 13, because that's a halfway point. It's actually 13 and a half, 12 and a half, 12.5. Okay. Sometimes they also use what are called the class or group boundaries. But most times it's midpoints, and I'm pretty sure that's what Minitab does, so we'll talk about that more. The vertical scale is probably either going to be your frequency, how many do you have in each group, or it could be represented by a percentage. The difference between a bar graph and a histogram is that with a histogram, the bars are connected because numbers in and of themselves are contiguous or continuous. I can have 1.5, 1.25, 1.05. So we can, they can break down. So we indicate that it's a continuous scale with the numbers, but there's no gaps in the numbers. We don't go, we don't jump from 10 to 15. We have to hit all of the numbers in between. So that's one of the big things with a histogram, is that there are no gaps between bars. Still with a histogram, any kind of table, anytime you're creating a table, you want that table to have a title again, with as much detail as possible. Let me see if I can show you a picture real quick of a histogram, just so you can have a better picture. Now that's not a great one because it doesn't give us a, well, where did it go? Okay, this one gives us a histogram of weights, and you can kind of see the weights are across the bottom. And if you can see it, notice how that little tick mark, it looks like it's in the middle of the bar. That's kind of my clue that they're using the midpoint. And then you have the frequency on the vertical. That one's kind of weird. It got distorted on my screen. Maybe that, here it is a little bit better. Okay, so that's a histogram. Again, the key thing there is there's no gaps between the bars. Then finally, we have a box plot. A box plot lets us get a picture of the 5-number summary of the data set. It also gives us a visual of the outliers. Now, I think we get to it really in the next lesson, but since I already mentioned it here, I'm going to tell you what the 5-number summary includes. The 5-number summary includes the minimum value in the data set. It includes what's called quartile 1, and we'll talk about what that means if you don't recall from your previous course. The median, which is the value in the middle of the data set. Quartile 3. And the maximum. And it can be drawn horizontally or vertically. And I'm going to rough sketch one here. I don't really have numbers to put into it, but I'm going to give you a rough sketch of what a box plot would look like. I have a tendency to draw it horizontally, so I might have something that looks like this. And this number here would be my minimum. This one is Q1. This is the median. This is Q3. And my maximum is here. And then it would also visualize any outliers that I have. But again, it gives me that sense of numbers and how those numbers are grouped together. And it really makes more sense when you see it with numbers in the context of a data set. Let me see if I can find you one that's been professionally done. Okay, so you can find examples of these things. You know, I just type in box plot. Whoops, I missed getting the T on there. Okay, a box plot, and it gives me pictures. So here's one, and again, that kind of just lets you see it. Again, it's done horizontally, but you can also see one that's done vertically. You can use box plots to compare different groups. Okay. You can, again, we can use them to, if you put in the actual data, you can see how it compares. So again, they're useful. We're going to keep it reasonably simple in this class, but again, it's an easy way for you to present information, and you are going to be expected on Mini Project 1 to use Minitab to create a bar chart, a histogram, and a box plot, and to interpret what that information tells you or what the trends are, just like we did with the graphs that we looked at. So that gets us through the first lesson in D2L. okay, the data and visualization. So you are ready to do quiz number 1, okay? And quiz number 1 is due by Sunday, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, so quiz number 1 is due by Sunday at midnight. Do you have questions? Okay, guys, if you don't have questions, then I will see you on Tuesday at 11, and we will pick up our discussion. Have a good weekend.
Thanks, you too.